Well, hello there, and welcome to A Film a Day with me, Jordan Woodley. A cure for wellness. It's a curious thing. I've talked previously about my love of horror, my love of psychological and cerebral horror, and the way that horror is used to examine social troubles, psychological troubles, the nature of being haunted. I've turned it over several times to examine all the different derivations of how horror can be used to examine self and society. And so it's very curious when I come across a film where the spirit of it is there, the components are there, and yet for whatever reason, it doesn't seem to come together to be a true representation of horror, or be have a soul to it, I suppose. And A Cure for Wellness is almost a textbook example of this, and it doesn't come up very often, because either you end up with your huge, big, blockbuster horrors where they're not intending to try and be more complicated, or you have the independent horrors, or the horrors that might be made by a big studio, but they're sort of throwing it out there. And of course, with Blumhouse, and A24, we're seeing studios specifically dedicated to horror. But you sometimes, now and then, get these films where it is a big name director, big name studio, trying their hand at something a bit more cerebral and a bit more complex than either a basic slasher or something you take something like The Ring, the adaptation of it, which of course is also done by the director of The Cure for Wellness, Gore Verbinski. But where The Ring seemed to succeed, there is that sense where what one would expect from watching, say, if you watch the original Ringu and then watch The Ring, you expect it to fail because it again, the Japanese style of horror, particularly of that period, knew how to tap into cerebral ideas of how we're haunted, and how you could sort of interplay technology with the supernatural, and you expect a US adaptation to really royally misunderstand and to go too big and Hollywood, to have too big, too high profile actors in it, etc., so that it doesn't have that visceral sense of horror to it. But to its credit, The Ring succeeded. Now, The Cure for Wellness, which is an original concept as far as I'm aware, I didn't see it being an adaptation of anything. Based on its structure and style, I would be tempted to say it could be a book adaptation, but I don't believe it is. And again, there is something interesting. There are really interesting ideas in amongst it, but at its core, it just doesn't quite know how to activate the true horror within it. And it falls into making poor character decisions and just very amateurish errors where it comes to sort of shocking us or leaving us with sort of horrific imagery. Now, in saying that, there are moments and ideas that are quite shocking and are quite disturbing and leave an impression, but they're so fleeting. And because they're sort of stuck together by long stretches of rather mediocre or underwhelming atmosphere building, the stuff that is sort of, leaves the impression, it just isn't strong enough for the rest of it. So the story follows a character played by Dane DeHaan, who is your very, very basic business jock. Like, he is sort of the stereotypical financier type character who has a very complicated he's quite an emotionally cut off person with a complex psychological past that means that he's become isolated and quite cold, but it's actually to his own detriment. And he's sent to fetch his boss, who has gone to this wellness retreat, somewhere in I think it's in the Swiss Alps, because the guy has basically said he's not coming back, and that he sort of has his condemnation of the person he's become and the world he lives in, that sort of corporate-y, cold, superficial world. And so Dane DeHaan comes and essentially is then embroiled within this place. It's supposed to be a wellness retreat, but there are it sort of harkens back to the sort of classic psychological hospitals, of sort of 60s and 70s films. And then there are these other questionable elements, like there's this very heavy-handed story about a baron, and this baron who in the I think it must be the 18th century was doing experiments, and there's this whole backstory, that sort of leads to why that site has such a complex history. And the elements, like I say, on paper they're all there, and it does seem like the kind of film that, were you to read the script, would be really interesting, with quite dark and insightful characters. A sort of, like I say, it throws back to the sort of 60s, 70s horror. I particularly was thinking about like Hammer, and how this was the kind of horror that probably would have perfectly suited sort of the Hammer horror style, particularly the Wicker Man-esque sort of era of that kind of storytelling. But all I could think of as I was watching it was the Guillermo del Toro film called Crimson Peak. And frankly, Crimson Peak might be my least favourite Guillermo del Toro film. And I love a lot of Guillermo del Toro's work. I think he's a great visionary filmmaker who does fantastic world building and monster design. But Crimson Peak is an example where it felt like a series of interesting ideas that didn't really work when you put them together, helmed by a director who who the passion for that story just didn't come through in the final product. And there are, like with The Cure for Wellness, interesting ideas about the nature of the house that they're based in, and sort of the fact that it's sinking. And of course, it throws, and that harkens back to things like the fall of the House of Usher, and that kind of the degradation and corruption of a family sort of destroys them from within. And then there are ghosts, but the ghosts are kind of arbitrary. And that's the problem. It has that sense of, these ideas are interesting, but they don't work together. They're not cohesive. And A Cure for Wellness I kept thinking about that, and the fact that I'm like, partly the directing style, there is this sort of sheen to it, where a different kind of director, a director like more like the one who did The Favourite, would fill it with a sense of atmosphere, and you can sense that Gore Verbinski is trying to inject it with this atmosphere. But there's just this sort of Hollywood sheen to it that means you don't get that sense of disturb, that sense of, atmosphere. It's as simple as it just doesn't, it lacks the atmosphere that I think it's trying to generate, that a film like a classic Hammer horror would do, where you get that sense of, as soon as the character arrives, everything is a threat. Even the atmosphere itself is sort of stifling. And like I say, I can see it trying to do that, but it just cannot manage it. And I feel bad, because Dane DeHaan, broadly speaking, he's an actor who I think is a very good actor who has not found the project to really bring him sort of up, as it were. And he's a respected actor who's has a Hollywood career, so there's no issues for him. But he feels like an actor, and of course throwing back to like Amazing Spider-Man 2, where of course I think he sort of, that's where his face became a bit more mainstream. He's an actor who clearly can do quite interesting character work and has a sense of the psychological about him. This character is kind of an asshole and is really unlikable, and there are reasons for that. But on the surface, this guy is just an unlikable person and very representative of sort of that corporate, shark America kind of thing that it's trying to sort of make commentary about. And you can see Dane DeHaan trying to sort of give it that sense of there's something more going on with this guy other than just the fact that he's this superficial, money-driven, soulless person. There is something else going on there, but like I say, it's the same as with the atmosphere. You can feel him trying, and yet for whatever reason, there's almost like this field of some kind that just prevents it from breaching that deeper character work that I think he's trying to do. And as I say, I feel bad because he's an actor who I've yet to see that performance from him that's just nails it. But I can see that he can do that. And of course you've got Jason Isaacs, who frankly, Jason Isaacs walks through this. I mean, Jason Isaacs is a phenomenal actor who very seldomly do I see him, even in things that are bad, you can see him doing something. It might not be necessarily great work, but you can see him going, okay, I have little to work with, I'm going to do this quirk with it. I'm going to try this different thing with it. And you can see him here. Again, this is one where he easily steps into this character, and this character is probably the best performed, although not the most interesting actor of the cast. I'll get onto that. But you can see Jason Isaacs trying to inject it. This character because this character is rich and interesting, and as the film unfolds, you get the layers of this guy's personality. And yeah, for the most part, he succeeds. But again, this invisible field that just prevents it from really coming together, means that I think he succeeds. It's just there's so little else for him to work with that it doesn't fulfill its potential. And then you have, is it Mia Goth? Mia Goth, who frankly is probably the best thing in this film, probably the best actor in this film. Mia Goth isn't an actress who I've particularly had any experience of, and frankly, she is the thing that works here, because there is something, of course there is something dreamlike about her character, and the nature of the plot means that she's sort of part child, part woman, somewhere in the middle, both neither, almost elf-like. And, you get that sort of woman in white style of storytelling of someone who is waif, and yet also there's a lot going on. And yeah, I have to say that she, in terms of sort of where she gets a chance to perform, there is something quite intriguing but also haunting about her and her performance. And so when it comes, when there's the scenes like the scene where she's dancing in the bar, it's so strange, and it's such a strange moment in the film that you can't help but be sort of intrigued by it. And so yeah, I do think she's an actor who absolutely really feels like that's the film I want to see through her, but that's the story I want to see. And then it's just, as I say, you have this ensemble, and of course you have all these patients who are in this hospital, and you have this sort of intrigue plot that's supposed to be horror, supposed to be ghost story, supposed to be mystery thriller, and it's none of those in its entirety. And like I say, it feels a shame because it just cannot bring them together, and as you get to the climax, and as things are, the horror is just not there. The horror's not there. There isn't a single moment in this film in which I'm afraid. There are moments, as I say, where I'm a little disturbed, and I'm like, okay, well that's something, but that's not enough. And so in terms of its horror components, it just doesn't succeed. the mystery aspect is intriguing, and when you sort of discover what it is, it's interesting enough. And there are elements I went, well, this is clearly this, and solved a lot of it. But when it sort of fully unfolds, you're like, oh, okay. It wasn't a disappointing answer to the mystery, but I can't say it hugely sort of satisfied my curiosity. And of course, once you get into that sort of analytical stage, then you really start to pick the plot apart, and you sort of question, well, if this stuff is doing this to these people, how come, how does it work with the staff, and and you just start to unpack it, where you just go, you start doing, or I start doing the thing which means I'm not clicking with the film, or I'm starting to sort of pick apart the plotting and say, well, how does it work here if this character's doing this, and why would this character act in this way? And this scene is interesting. There's a big climax scene in the canteen, and if there's any moment that's actually a little bit haunting, that does have that moment. But it's too little too late, and frankly, it's not enough. And when I say too little too late, it sort of feeds into the other problem, which is this film is way too long. This is a nearly 2.5 hour film. And the rule when it comes to horror is almost the same with comedy. 90 minutes to 2 hours is your sort of peak point, because horror ultimately only really works in a contained amount. Because horror, we're not triggering our actual fear in regards of, our actual phobias or anxieties. We are simply artificially experience it because it's a fictional narrative. And if you push a film to being more than 2 hours, our brains eventually just accept that the reality that we're experiencing isn't real, and we have no need to be afraid. And so we just get, there aren't many horror films that are more than 2 hours that you don't just get a bit bored with, because you can't be in a state of fear for that long, not when it's not real. And so, it's not like putting a spider in the lap of a arachnophobic, or making someone who's afraid of heights skydive for 2 hours. You can't recreate that. And so, like I say, it just becomes dull. It just becomes dull. And 2.5 hours, you're getting to the point where the moments, as I say, that were disturbing or haunting, you think, that's faded into distant memory. And there are some things about the ending that are quite interesting. It doesn't really work, and it does, and the very ending, and I won't spoil it, but the very ending is so anticlimactic, and I'm talking like the last couple of minutes, and so sort of unresolved that it's disappointing. It's actually, well, what did that mean? Where's this? What were you trying to say with this thing? And it does fall, because it doesn't commit to being a true horror. It doesn't, or at least doesn't feel like it's committing to being a true horror. It doesn't. The haunting ending that it wants to create just doesn't exist, and so therefore there's no sense of intrigue or ambiguity. It's just, oh, okay, well, that's a weird way to end the film. Yeah, it's disappointing, and I'm always disappointed when I sort of go into a film with little knowledge and come out thinking, that is the way it is. But can't be helped. And it's a shame, because I think it's just the waste of potential, and there's nothing worse than seeing the waste of potential. This is definitely the kind of film that I think, if it had been made in the 1970s, would have absolutely nailed its beats. Anyway, thank you for joining me. If you liked the video, hit the like button, comment below, and share the video, because there's all help with the algorithm. Subscribe to the channel and hit that bell to get notifications of when new videos are uploaded. Check out my back catalogue of almost 250 videos. It is upon us. And follow me on Twitter at Jordan_Woodley, where I tweet about TV shows and films, and I share these videos once they're uploaded to YouTube, either the day of or the day after. Thank you for joining me. Take care.